Good evening, my dear friends, and welcome once more to our cozy little corner of mystery. Picture it, a frosty evening in a quiet English village, the bookshop windows glowing, the kettle singing on the hob, and a fire crackling in the grate. Tonight's story is Mystery Behind the Old Friends, and New Murder, a Miss Marple Mystery. But all is not as peaceful as it seems. For among familiar faces, one cherished friendship hides a dangerous secret. A torn page from an old letter may be the only clue. Chapter 1. Whispers Over Seed Cake. Morning in St. Mildred's dawned with a deceptive serenity, as though the events of the gala had been nothing more than a troubling dream. Frost glazed the hedgerows, and smoke curled from cottage chimneys. The world wrapped once again in the comfort of routine. Yet beneath the calm surface, curiosity simmered, refusing to be quelled. For in a village, nothing stirs conversation more thoroughly than an unexpected death. The post office, as ever, became the first stage for speculation. Mrs. Armitage, who prided herself on both her punctuality and her moral certainties, stood at the counter, her breath fogging slightly in the chilly air. She leaned forward to confide to Mrs. Simpkins, who was buying stamps with elaborate deliberation. It was his heart. Mark my words, Mrs. Armitage declared. Men of his age never know when to stop. Overexertion, that's all. Nothing more sinister. But her certainty was immediately challenged by Mr. Pritchard, the retired schoolmaster, who had the air of one imparting grave knowledge. Poison, he whispered, lowering his voice though everyone in the room strained to hear. The glass slipped from his hand. Yes, but did you notice the color of his lips? Blue, quite unmistakable. I've seen it in textbooks. Mrs. Simpkins gasped and clutched her bag, while Mrs. Armitage pursed her lips in disapproval. Really, Mr. Pritchard, you've always had a morbid imagination. Next you'll be telling us there's a murderer in our midst. Meanwhile, Miss Marple sat unobtrusively in a corner chair by the fire, her knitting needles clicking softly. She had brought her parcels to post, but found the lively exchange more absorbing than her own errands. Her expression remained mild, even vaguely distracted, yet her sharp blue eyes missed very little. The way Mrs. Armitage's fingers trembled ever so slightly, the curious satisfaction that glimmered in Mr. Pritchard's eyes at holding the room's attention. Such things spoke volumes, if one only took the trouble to notice. Later that morning, the gossip migrated to the village tea room. The little bell above the door jingled constantly as customers came and went, each with fresh theories to contribute. A faint scent of cinnamon buns lingered in the air, mingling oddly with talk of sudden death. "It's strange, isn't it?" said young Mrs. Carter, her cheeks flushed from the cold. He hadn't been back in St. Mildred's for more than a fortnight, and now this. Some people say he came to make peace with old quarrels, but others think, well, that he came to stir them up again. Miss Marple looked down at her knitting, the neat rows of gray wool forming steadily beneath her fingers. People revealed much in how they chose their words, but even more in what they avoided. Mrs. Carter had spoken too quickly, as though repeating something overheard. Miss Marple tucked that detail away gently, as she tucked a loose thread into her work. At the far table, the butcher's wife leaned across the sugar bowl and lowered her voice. "My cousin swears she saw him in the corridor not half an hour before the collapse. He wasn't alone. He was in quite a heated argument with someone we all know." The tea room fell into a sudden hush. Even the spoons seemed to pause mid-stir. Miss Marple did not look up, but a single stitch slipped from her needle, as though in quiet acknowledgment. An argument before the end. Now that was most interesting indeed. The vicarage at St. Mildred's was a place of comfort, where the smell of beeswax polish and the faint sweetness of dried lavender seemed to linger in every corner. That afternoon, Miss Marple was invited to tea, and she arrived punctually, wrapped in her neat gray coat, her scarf tucked carefully beneath her chin. The frost of the morning had not yet melted from the garden path, and her footsteps crunched faintly as she made her way to the door. Mrs. Dane, the vicar's wife, opened it with her usual warmth. She was a brisk woman with capable hands, always smelling faintly of flour or polish, and she ushered Miss Marple into the cozy sitting room where the fire burned merrily. The tea tray was already set, scones with clotted cream, a small plate of ginger biscuits, and a pot steaming fragrantly. "Such a dreadful business last night," Mrs. Dane said, pouring out the tea. "One hardly knows what to think. Poor man, it seems such a shock, and yet perhaps not wholly unexpected." She glanced meaningfully at her husband, who was already spreading cream on a scone with a rather guilty air, as though he feared his appetite might be judged inappropriate. Miss Marple accepted her cup with a gentle nod, her eyes lowered. "He had been away a long time," she remarked softly, "and when people return after many years, they bring their histories back with them, sometimes more baggage than anyone realizes." Mr. Dane cleared his throat. There were certain quarrels in the past, old debts, old grievances. Villages do not forget so easily, Miss Marple, though we like to think ourselves forgiving. The conversation drifted between sips of tea and the quiet clink of porcelain. Names were mentioned: an estranged cousin, a business partner left embittered, even a lady who had once been courted and then cast aside. Miss Marple listened as though half distracted by her scone, but in truth she heard the pauses as clearly as the words. Mrs. Dane's voice faltered ever so slightly when she mentioned the cousin. The vicar looked into the fire too long when the business quarrel was raised. These absences of sound were, to Miss Marple, as revealing as any confession. At last, Mrs. Dane leaned forward, lowering her voice to a near whisper. "There is one thing I find troubling. The constable told me they could not account for a missing glass. You see, each place was carefully cleared away after the gala, but when they counted, there was one short." Miss Marple's knitting bag rested quietly on her lap. She did not move, only tightened her fingers around the wool. "A missing glass?" she repeated mildly, as though it were the most ordinary of oversights. "Yes, it may be nothing, of course. People set things down in odd places. But when one thinks of, well, what Mr. Pritchard was saying at the post office." Mrs. Dane flushed and did not finish her sentence. Miss Marple smiled gently, though her eyes remained thoughtful. "Indeed, one never knows what small object might prove important. A glass misplaced, or," she paused delicately, lifting her cup, "or hidden." The fire popped softly in the grate, as though emphasizing her words, and Mrs. Dane shivered, though the room was warm. Chapter 2. Footprints by Lantern Light. Constable Hargreaves arrived at the tea room that afternoon with the air of a man burdened by the weight of too many questions and too few answers. He was a broad fellow, cheeks ruddy from the cold, and he tugged at his cap as he stood rather awkwardly among the clustered villagers. They had gathered, as villagers always do, where talk was warm and plentiful, and now all eyes fixed expectantly on him. "Well," he began, clearing his throat, "there's nothing, as yet, to suggest foul play. Dr. Bellamy himself confirmed the poor gentleman's death could have been the result of natural causes. A weak heart, you see. Sudden, yes, but not unheard of." There was a collective murmur, half relieved, half disappointed. Villagers thrive on drama, and though they would never say so aloud, an accident was far less thrilling than a crime. But Hargreaves continued, raising a hand as though to calm them. "There is one matter that doesn't quite fit. Muddy footprints, leading from the side door of the church hall. clear enough in the frost, though they trailed off once they reached the lane. Not made by anyone local, so far as I can tell. At once, speculation flared. Mrs. Armitage, never one to resist an audience, said in her most knowing tone, "Smuggler's boots, most likely. You can always tell. My brother once saw such tracks near Lyme Regis." Mr. Pritchard sniffed. "Nonsense. Smugglers in this day and age. More likely some stranger, slipping in unnoticed and slipping out again after his deed was done." A hush fell, heavier than the one before. The word deed carried more weight than either wished to admit. Miss Marple, seated by the window with her knitting in her lap, did not glance up, though her needles clicked in steady rhythm. She had lived long enough to know that footprints, like people, often told more than they intended. The angle of the heel, the depth of the tread, such small things spoke volumes to those willing to listen. But if the man died of his heart, ventured Mrs. Carter timidly, what need had anyone to come and go by the side door? Unless she stopped, realizing her own suggestion sounded perilous. "Unless," supplied Mr. Pritchard, his eyes gleaming, "they had a reason to meet unseen." The room stirred with whispers. Could it be that someone had arranged a secret rendezvous? A quarrel, perhaps? Or an assignation less proper? In a village, every possibility is entertained with equal relish. Constable Hargreaves looked pained. Now, let's not get carried away. It could be nothing more than one of the choir slipping out for a breath of air. It was then that old Mrs. Pembroke, who had been silent until now, raised her thin voice. "Breath of air, indeed. I saw him, just before it happened, out by the side door, speaking to someone in hushed tones. He seemed upset." She paused, her wrinkled hands trembling as she twisted her handkerchief. "And whoever he spoke to, they kept well in the shadows." At this, the knitting needles in Miss Marple's hands paused for the briefest of moments, then resumed their quiet click. The church hall was quiet that morning, emptied of laughter, music, and the rustle of party finery. The decorations still hung from their hooks, paper garlands slightly sagging, evergreen boughs drooping as though they, too, had heard the somber news. The air carried that faint, stale sweetness of spilt wine and extinguished candles, with a sharper note beneath it that Miss Marple did not dismiss. She had asked, quite mildly, if she might look in. Constable Hargreaves, grateful for any pair of eyes less excitable than the villagers, obliged without fuss. He soon busied himself with his notebook, while Miss Marple moved slowly across the polished floor, her step as unobtrusive as a shadow. Her gaze wandered not to the center of the room, where others had crowded the night before, but to the edges. She noted the side door, faintly scuffed, as though opened and shut more often than was necessary. Near the corner, a lantern lay tilted against the wall, its wick blackened but untrimmed. Someone had replaced it hastily, she thought, and not in its proper place. Such oversights were seldom innocent. Miss Marple's eyes lifted toward the choir loft. Few people thought to look upward, but she had long ago discovered the usefulness of doing so. The narrow stairs creaked faintly under her weight, and the air grew cooler as she ascended. Dust lay thinly on the railing, except in one place, where a smudge of disturbance was clear. A hand, she surmised, had rested there, steadying itself during some tense moment. She leaned ever so slightly over the rail, gazing down on the hall below. From this vantage, one might easily observe the comings and goings of the guests. To the imaginative or the guilty, it was a perfect perch. As she descended, that faint sharp note returned to her senses. At first she thought it no more than extinguished candle wax or the tang of polish. But no, it was sharper, almost bitter. She paused, bending slightly as though adjusting her shoe. The air near the side table, where glasses had been collected, carried it most distinctly. Bitter almonds, an odor she remembered from more than one unhappy tale in her long acquaintance with human frailty. Miss Marple straightened slowly, smoothing her gloves. Others might overlook such a trace, dismiss it as fancy. Yet she knew better. For the human heart may fail without warning, but almonds did not belong in the scent of a Christmas gala. The hall stood hushed about her, as though holding its breath. She gathered her knitting bag, ready to return home, her expression one of mild distraction. Only the faint tightening at the corners of her mouth betrayed her thoughts. It was no accident, she murmured softly, to no one in particular. Chapter 3. The Wrong Suspect. It was inevitable, perhaps, that suspicion should fasten on the weakest link in the village chain. By mid-morning, word had spread. Young Elsie Turner, the maid-of-all-work at the hall, had been taken aside by Constable Hargreaves. Her scarf, blue wool, with a tear at one edge, had been discovered lying damp and muddied near the side door of the church. In St. Mildred's, such a discovery was as damning as a signed confession. Mrs. Armitage declared with a kind of solemn triumph that she had always considered the girl flighty. Mr. Pritchard, shaking his head gravely, hinted that low wages and envy could drive even the meekest to desperate acts. And poor Mrs. Carter wrung her hands, lamenting that it was always the young girls who go astray. Elsie herself sat pale and trembling in the vestry, her hands twisting in her lap. She was no more than 17, with large eyes that seemed always uncertain whether to widen with wonder or brim with tears. She protested that she had merely mislaid the scarf, that she had lent it, perhaps, or dropped it in the bustle. But the villagers had little interest in such explanations. Once suspicion takes hold, it clings as stubbornly as ivy to old stone. Miss Marple, arriving quietly with her knitting bag on her arm, took a seat near the fire and observed without intruding. After a time, when the clucking of accusations had lulled, she leaned forward in her gentle way. "My dear," she said softly, "I wonder if you might tell me where you were just before the collapse. Only if you please, of course. Sometimes, when one is frightened, details slip away, but I find they come back if one speaks them calmly." Elsie glanced up, her lips parting. She hesitated, then whispered, "I was fetching more cups from the kitchen. The steward had asked me, you see. I wasn't anywhere near the side door." "Truly, ma'am, I wasn't." Miss Marple's eyes rested kindly on the girl. "And yet your scarf was found outside. That is curious, is it not? Did you lend it, perhaps?" A faint flush touched Elsie's cheeks. "Only once, to Annie, one of the village girls. But not that night. I had it in my pocket when I came to the gala. I swear I did." The constable frowned, muttering about inconsistencies, but Miss Marple merely nodded. Inconsistencies could be the signs of a lie, or of an innocence muddled by fear. She had seen both often enough. "Tell me," Miss Marple continued, her voice mild, "when you fetched those cups, did you notice anything unusual? Sometimes servants see more than their masters, though no one thinks to ask." Elsie's fingers twisted more tightly in her lap. Her voice trembled. "I saw someone. By the side door. They were slipping away, quick as you please. At first I thought it nothing, but then I realized I knew them. Someone from the village." The room fell silent at her words. Constable Hargreaves leaned forward sharply, but Miss Marple, her needles now still in her lap, inclined her head ever so slightly. "A familiar face?" she asked, her tone light as falling snow. Elsie nodded, eyes wide. "Yes, ma'am. Someone I ought never have seen there at all." By the following morning, St. Mildred's was split clean down the middle. as neatly as a loaf of bread cut with a sharp knife. In the snug of the post office, Mrs. Armitage stood firm in her opinion that Elsie Turner was guilty as sin. "Mark my words," she declared, her voice carrying like the church bell on a frosty morning. "Girls like that always come to a bad end. Too much paint on her lips, and never a thought for honesty." Across the counter, Mrs. Carter sniffed indignantly. "She's nothing but a child, poor lamb. Do you think a girl of 17 could plan something so wicked?" She clutched her parcels of seed cake and soap powder as though they might fly away in the storm of argument. In the tea room, matters were no calmer. Mr. Pritchard, with his usual solemnity, spoke of the moral decline of youth, citing Elsie's nervous stammer as evidence of guilt. "The truth will out," he intoned gravely, "and when it does, I fear it will not be pleasant." Yet at a nearby table, young Annie Fletcher and her mother were quick to defend their friend. "Elsie wouldn't hurt a fly," Annie cried hotly. "She cries if she steps on a beetle, for heaven's sake." Thus the village fractured, with voices rising, grudges rekindled, and old slights dragged into the light. Mrs. Blakely, who had once quarreled with Elsie's mother over borrowed lace, was the loudest in her condemnation. Meanwhile, Mr. Hewitt, who owed the girl's uncle a debt of kindness, spoke in her defense with surprising vigor. It seemed that in St. Mildred's, guilt or innocence mattered less than the tangled web of past favors and forgotten resentments. Miss Marple, seated quietly by the fire in the tea-room, observed it all with her usual calm. Her needles clicked softly, silver glinting against the pale wool, as she listened to the rise and fall of voices. She knew well enough how quickly suspicion settled on the powerless. A maid without fortune, family, or firm allies was the easiest scapegoat in the world. People were eager to point fingers where they feared no reprisal. She reflected, with the faintest smile, that true guilt rarely shouted from the rooftops. It did not parade itself with noisy gossip or accusatory zeal. Instead, it whispered, quiet, evasive, careful, lurking in pauses and silences in the things not said. And so, while others clamored about Elsie's scarf and nervousness, Miss Marple kept her mind fixed on the smaller, more telling details. It was just as she reached for her teacup that the postmistress bustled into the tea-room, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "You'll never believe what's come to light," she cried, holding up a weathered envelope for all to see, found among Mr. Denholm's papers, hidden at the bottom of a drawer. A letter, old as Methuselah, but clear as day. And it speaks of betrayal, no less. The room fell into a hush. Cups were set down with trembling hands. Chairs scraped against the floor as villagers leaned in. Betrayal was a word to chill even the warmest tea. Miss Marple's pale eyes lifted from her knitting. A letter, was it? From the past, long kept and long concealed. Such things had a way of tugging at threads one thought safely tied off. She allowed herself the quietest murmur, audible only to her own ears. Now, that is very curious indeed. Chapter 4. Letters and Lies. The letter was a fragile thing, its paper browned with age, its folds softened by many readings. Constable Hargreaves produced it reluctantly, as though it might disintegrate in his large, calloused hands. He laid it on the polished oak table in the vicarage drawing-room, where Miss Marple and the vicar's wife leaned closer, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and unease. It was addressed, in a looping, foreign hand, to Mr. Edward Denholm, our unfortunate deceased, and bore the faded postmark of some distant port. Lisbon, perhaps, or Tangier. The ink had blurred in places. The contents, however, were clear enough. "My dear Denholm," it began, "I write not to reproach you, though I have cause. The matter of the funds is not forgotten, nor the promise you made when last we met. You assured me all would be settled on your return, and yet years have passed, and silence is all I have had from you. You will understand that such neglect cannot continue indefinitely. If you value peace of mind, you will make this right. I shall not be kept waiting forever. The signature was nothing more than a set of initials, R.H., but they hung in the air like smoke. Mrs. Weatherby, the vicar's wife, pressed her hand to her lips. "How very dreadful," she whispered. "Money owed, and a broken promise. It sounds quite like the stories in the penny weeklies, doesn't it?" But Miss Marple's eyes were sharp, her thoughts moving along quieter, more intricate paths. She asked to see the envelope once more and turned it delicately between her fingers. A man does not keep a letter for over a decade, unless it has meaning, she reflected. This one had been folded, unfolded, carried, and preserved. Not discarded, not destroyed. Reconciliation or revenge. Both were plausible motives for Denholm's return to St. Mildred's. He had arrived in the village with a suddenness that startled even his own kin, appearing at the Christmas gala like a ghost from another life. And now, with this letter, one might ask, whom had he come to confront? The villagers, of course, had their theories. In the tea-room, Mrs. Armitage insisted the initials R.H. must belong to old Robert Hewitt, who had once invested money unwisely at Denholm's urging. "Mark my words, he's come back to squeeze the poor man dry," she exclaimed. Others muttered of Reginald Harris, a distant cousin long since vanished to the colonies. Still others whispered of Rosemary Hargreaves, the constable's own aunt, who had lent Denholm a tidysome in her youth. In St. Mildred's, there was no shortage of R.H.'s. Miss Marple, however, thought less of the names than of the tone. The writer had not threatened outright, but neither had he pleaded. It was the language of one who believed himself wronged, and who intended the wrong should not go unpunished. And then, most tellingly, there was the timing. Why should the letter resurface now, at the very moment Denholm lay dead? Had he kept it with him all these years, or had it recently been returned to him? She set down her teacup, her gaze thoughtful. There were more knots in this skein than any villager suspected. Denholm's return was not the simple homecoming it had seemed. Far from it. He had stepped back into St. Mildred's, carrying with him a past bristling with unpaid debts and broken vows. Miss Marple allowed herself a small sigh. "It seems," she murmured, "that more than one among us may have had cause to dread Mr. Denholm's reappearance. And dread, as I have observed, can be a most dangerous sentiment indeed." It was late afternoon when Miss Marple made her way along the frost-dusted lane to the little cottage at the edge of the green. Smoke curled from the chimney, steady and respectable, and the garden gate creaked as she pushed it open. Mrs. Lydia Fenton, widow of the late solicitor, was known for her tidy habits and careful manner of speech. Few in St. Mildred's suspected her of anything beyond an inordinate fondness for roses. Yet Miss Marple, who understood the world far better than most, knew that beneath orderly gardens and polished parlors often lay tangled roots. Mrs. Fenton welcomed her with a subdued smile and ushered her into the sitting room. The curtains were half drawn against the cold, the fire burned briskly, and a tray of shortbread rested on the table. They spoke at first of village trifles, of the snow likely to come, of Mrs. Armitage's endless speculations, of the new curate's unfortunate sermons. But as the silence between them lengthened, Mrs. Fenton's composure faltered. "I suppose you have heard," she said at last, her hands tightening around her teacup, "that Edward Denholm and I were acquainted." Miss Marple inclined her head gently. "One hears things, my dear." The widow gave a small, rueful laugh. "Acquainted, that is a mild word for it. He proposed to me once, many years ago, when I was scarcely more than a girl. I was quite taken with him. Oh, yes, he had a charm about him, I will not deny it. I thought my future quite secure. And then she broke off, her voice sharp with memory. And then he chose another, some visiting lady of fortune, all sparkle and feathers. He left me humiliated, and with whispers following me through every lane and tea-room in this village. Miss Marple listened with a look of soft compassion, though her needles never ceased their gentle rhythm. She understood that old wounds, though covered, seldom healed without a scar. Mrs. Fenton continued, her tone low and steady. I married John Fenton afterwards, and he was kind, a good man. But I never quite forgot. When Denholm appeared at the gala the other night, older, grayer, but unmistakably himself, it was as though the years had rolled back. I felt all the old bitterness stir again, though I smiled and spoke as politely as anyone. Her eyes, usually so mild, gleamed with a spark of long-buried resentment. You must think me wicked, Miss Marple, to admit such things. Not wicked, my dear, Miss Marple said kindly. Only human. We none of us forget the slights of youth so easily. And disappointment, well, that lingers longer than most ailments. The widow gave a sigh, pressing a handkerchief to her lips. For a moment the room was filled only with the ticking of the mantel clock. Then, almost in a whisper, she added, I could not help thinking, as I watched him move among the villagers, what if he had come back not for merriment, but to unsettle old accounts? What if he meant to expose the past, to shame those of us who had once trusted him? Miss Marple set down her knitting, her blue eyes fixed upon Mrs. Fenton's. Her voice was mild, but the question cut with precision. And on the night of the gala, my dear, where were you truly? The widow's hands trembled, and the firelight flickered across her strained face. Chapter 5. Shadows at the Vicarage. The vicarage, with its ivy-clad walls and frost-tipped hedges, stood in a hush that winter night, as though it too had secrets it would rather not reveal. The village lay still beneath a pale moon, snowlight glimmering across rooftops, yet the memory of what had occurred lingered like a chill no hearth could drive away. It was over tea and seed cake the next morning that the Reverend Lawson, his brow creased with unease, at last spoke of it to Miss Marple. He had been reluctant. Clergymen are careful with confidences, but the strain of recent days weighed upon him. I fear I did not sleep soundly, he admitted, stirring his cup though he had long since added sugar. After midnight, when all should have been quiet, I heard footsteps by the vicarage gate. Not hurried, you understand, but measured, as though someone walked with purpose. And then he hesitated. I saw the glow of a lantern through the curtains, faint but distinct. A moment later, it was extinguished quite suddenly, as though snuffed out. Miss Marple's eyes, pale and keen, rested on him. You did not venture out, I suppose. I know, he confessed, coloring faintly. It seemed imprudent, but I cannot rid myself of the notion that someone lingered there. Why at such an hour? And for what purpose? Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime observing both gardens and people, knew that midnight footsteps seldom signified anything innocent. Someone had returned to the vicarage grounds, she thought, not to stroll but to conceal, or to recover, something best kept hidden. Later that day, she took a quiet turn about the garden herself. The paths were stiff with frost, crunching lightly beneath her sensible shoes. She paused by the hedge near the gate, where the soil was darkened in one spot, softer than the earth surrounding it. Kneeling with surprising ease for her age, she pinched a bit of the soil between gloved fingers. There was a faint, acrid tang to it that prickled at her senses. Her mind, keen though kindly, reached back through years of stories, cases, and tragedies she had encountered. It was no mere dampness she detected. She had known that smell before, in accounts of sudden deaths and ill-fated experiments. Cyanide. She remained crouched for a moment, the winter air pressing cold against her cheeks, the bare branches overhead rattling like bones. A curious choice of poison, but not an uncommon one for those who desired finality. And here, beneath the vicarage hedge, it had been spilled, discarded, perhaps in haste when concealment grew too pressing. Miss Marple rose slowly, brushing the soil from her glove, her face composed. To anyone glancing out from the vicarage window, she might have seemed an elderly lady pausing to admire the hedge. But within her, threads of suspicion began to weave more tightly together. Someone had been here, under cover of night, not long after Edward Denholm's collapse, and someone had sought to rid themselves of a dangerous trace. That faint scent lingering in the church hall had not deceived her. It was no failing heart that had struck him down. As she turned back toward the vicarage door, the bells of St. Mildred's tolled the quarter hour. Their sound, so familiar, now seemed to carry a darker note. Miss Marple's lips tightened, though her voice, when she spoke softly to herself, was calm and certain. The hand that leaves traces by lantern light cannot remain hidden forever. The vicarage sitting room was unusually full that morning, every chair occupied by someone eager or anxious to hear the reading of Edward Denholm's will. The fire crackled in the hearth, but it was not warmth the villagers sought. Instead, their eyes flicked between one another, restless and speculative, as though the very walls might leak secrets if stared at long enough. The solicitor, Mr. Faraday, a precise man with the air of a watchmaker, cleared his throat and began. He unfolded the heavy parchment, adjusting his spectacles as he read. At first, the details were as expected. Minor bequests to servants, a few keepsakes to distant relatives, modest sums to charities that no one could quite remember donating to. A murmur of polite approval or relief rippled through the room. Then came the passage that made every heart pause. To Miss Clarissa Hawthorne, read Mr. Faraday, his voice steady, I bequeath the sum of £5,000, together with my collection of rare books and the property known as Hawthorne Cottage. It is my hope that Miss Hawthorne will preserve them with the care and discretion befitting their value and history. The room erupted in quiet gasps and stifled exclamations. Miss Hawthorne, a retired schoolmistress known for her unobtrusive manners and modest habits, sat frozen in her chair, hands folded tightly in her lap. She had never been especially close to Mr. Denholm, no more than a casual acquaintance in village gatherings. Mrs. Armitage, ever swift with judgment, leaned forward in scandalized fascination. Why her? Why not a family member, or someone connected to the hall? Mr. Pritchard shook his head slowly. Curious indeed. Perhaps she had some secret influence over him. Or he sought to reward discretion. One cannot tell, of course. Suspicions, previously aimed at young Elsie or the distant RH of the letter, shifted suddenly, as if a gust of wind had overturned all prior assumptions. Could Miss Hawthorne have known more than she revealed? Was there a hidden understanding between her and Denholm? The villager's imagination, once restrained by polite society, now ran riot. Miss Marple, seated in her quiet corner by the window, her knitting bag in her lap, observed the commotion with her customary patience. She did not speak, for the moment demanded observation rather than comment. Her needles clicked steadily, a subtle metronome against the rise and fall of whispered conjecture. She watched eyes narrow, hands twitch, and the subtle exchanges of glances that often betrayed hidden knowledge. Each gesture, each pause, added threads to a tapestry of motives far more intricate than anyone outside this small circle could perceive. There was envy, certainly. There was fear of scandal. and there was, unmistakably, the ever-present lure of money and property. People, she mused, often acted not with malice alone, but with a blend of self-interest and old grudges. Miss Hawthorne herself, for her part, made no protest beyond a faint, almost imperceptible shake of her head. Her lips were pressed tightly, her eyes fixed on the fire, as if the sudden attention were an unpleasant draught. It occurred to Miss Marple that the true measure of character often revealed itself, not in words, but in stillness, in the quiet way one withstands scrutiny. As the solicitor continued with smaller bequests, the villagers whispered furiously among themselves, ideas of motive multiplying with each breath. The hall seemed alive with tension, the kind that tightens a room like a drawn bowstring. Miss Marple's needles moved on, precise and unhurried, but behind the soft rhythm, her eyes were sharper than ever. She noted the flinches, the involuntary gestures, the subtle marks of thought or fear on the faces around her. Whatever threads had been hidden before, she knew they were beginning to unravel. Chapter 6. Tea with a Trap. Miss Marple had always found that a quiet cup of tea could reveal more than hours of interrogation. The mind, she observed, was most inclined to slip when lulled by comfort and routine. So it was that she proposed a small gathering at the village inn, a table set near the fire, tea steaming in delicate china cups, scones arranged in a circle like sentinels of civility. "I thought it might be pleasant," she said softly to the innkeeper, "to have a few friends of Mr. Denholm together. One can discuss matters over tea far more pleasantly than in a hall full of speculation." The inn, with its low beams and warm hearth, was already quiet from the midday lull. The smell of baked bread mingled with the soft tang of roasted chestnuts. Miss Marple selected a table where all could be seen without intruding upon their personal space, placing herself at a corner from which the subtle movements of every guest could be observed. Invitations were delivered delicately, each by hand, worded as casually as possible. To Elsie Turner, it was framed as a reassurance, a small token of kindness. To Miss Hawthorne, it was an acknowledgment of her role as an unexpected beneficiary. And to Mrs. Fenton, whose past ties to Denholm had been revealed, it was phrased as a simple courtesy, though Miss Marple knew well it would bring back old memories. When the guests arrived, Miss Marple greeted them with her usual quiet charm. She poured tea with gentle precision, arranging the cups so that none would have to reach across the table and none could avoid eye contact. Conversation began lightly. Weather, village happenings, the curious frost of recent nights. The vicar spoke of his sermons, Mrs. Armitage, inevitably, of local gossip, young Annie Fletcher of her mother's new preserves. Miss Marple, knitting quietly, introduced her own topics as one might drop a feather to see which way the wind blows. "I wonder," she said softly, "how people sometimes recall the smallest details from long ago. A misplaced glass, a forgotten promise, even the scent of bitter almonds. Do you not find it remarkable how memory clings to such things?" Eyes shifted, lips tightened, and small glances flickered like shadows across the firelight. Miss Marple noted them all, her needles clicking in measured rhythm. The vicar coughed gently. Mrs. Fenton's fingers hovered nervously near her teacup. Elsie's eyes darted, almost imperceptibly, toward the far corner where a chair had been left slightly askew. Miss Hawthorne's brow furrowed. The conversation drifted, light and seemingly unremarkable, as Miss Marple continued to sprinkle subtle remarks about the gala, about footprints by the side door, about the disappearance of glass, and the faint traces of almond that lingered in unexpected places. Each phrase was gentle, casual, yet calculated, like a net thrown with the softest of hands. It was then, as she mentioned a detail that no villager could have known but the one responsible, that the trap began to tighten. A slip of the tongue, a comment about the exact time someone had moved from the side door, caused a brief, telling pause. Miss Marple's eyes, as pale and unflinching as frost on a window pane, rested upon the speaker. The hand nearest the cup trembled ever so slightly, and a faint flush spread across a face previously composed. The inn, warm and inviting as it seemed, had become a chamber of subtle truths, where words weighed heavier than the tea itself. Miss Marple's soft smile betrayed nothing, yet beneath it a web of observation was being spun, thread by careful thread. And at that precise moment, she knew. One among them had been caught unawares, betrayed by knowledge only the guilty could possess. Miss Marple's gaze swept the table once more, her pale eyes catching every flicker of hesitation, every involuntary twitch. Yet it was not the seasoned villagers who provided the most telling details that day, but a small, quiet observer who had sat at the edge of the room, unnoticed until now. Little Samuel Fletcher, barely 8 years old, had been pressed into service as a helper, carrying napkins and refilling teacups, entirely overlooked by adults engrossed in their conversation. "Miss Marple," he piped suddenly, his small voice breaking the calm. "I remember something." Heads turned with polite surprise, and the room became suddenly still. Even the vicar paused mid-sip, and Mrs. Armitage clutched her teacup with renewed tension. "Go on, Samuel," Miss Marple encouraged gently, her knitting needles stilled in her lap. "What is it you recall?" The boy shuffled slightly, his gaze dropping to the floor before flicking up to meet hers. "It was at the gala," he began, "when everyone was dancing. I was running to fetch some more glasses for the punch, and I saw Mr. Denholm give, an envelope to someone. They whispered, and then it was taken quickly, like a secret." A hush fell over the table. The villagers leaned in, eager yet restrained, sensing that the innocence of a child often revealed truths that adults missed. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her expression one of quiet approval. "An excellent observation, Samuel. You noticed something many others would not even consider significant. And what did you see of the person who received the envelope?" The boy hesitated, biting his lip. I think I know them. It was someone I see sometimes in the village. They wore a dark coat and a hat, and they looked nervous." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with a quiet satisfaction. Children, she had always observed, were the most honest witnesses precisely because they did not yet know how to shade the truth. They saw and reported, unclouded by suspicion or fear of social consequences. "Very good, Samuel," she said warmly, patting his hand. "You have done a great service. You observed what adults might overlook, a gesture, a shadow, a hurried exchange." The villagers murmured among themselves, their theories suddenly shifting as the boy's testimony sank in. Faces previously calm now flickered with unease. Miss Marple's soft voice, like a thread through the tension, guided the room's attention without need of accusation. She leaned back slightly, knitting needles poised once more, though the wool remained untouched. "It is often the smallest details," she said, almost to herself, "the things easily dismissed that reveal the heart of a matter." Samuel beamed, proud to have contributed, yet unaware of the weight his words carried. The room seemed to hold its breath, the firelight flickering across a tableau of startled realization. Miss Marple's mind, ever alert, began to fit together the fragments. Footprints, the missing glass, the midnight lantern, the exchanged envelope. Finally, she lowered her eyes from the boy, her face serene, almost gentle. Yet the air about her held the unmistakable authority of someone who had seen the whole pattern, understood the invisible threads tying past to present, and discerned the hand behind them. In a soft voice, barely more than a whisper, she spoke to no one in particular, yet loud enough that the assembly felt the weight of her certainty. Now I know. Chapter 7. The Drawing Room Reveal. The vicarage drawing room was hushed, its curtains drawn against the pale afternoon light, the fire casting warm, flickering shadows across the polished floorboards. Chairs had been arranged in a loose semicircle, enough to seat all who had been most closely connected to Edward Denholm. Miss Marple sat in her customary corner, knitting bag beside her, her pale eyes sweeping over each familiar face with calm precision. "It is, I think, time we review the sequence of events," she began softly, her voice carrying a clarity that demanded attention without raising alarm. Sometimes, when details are laid side by side, the truth becomes unavoidable. The villagers leaned forward instinctively, sensing that the moment had arrived. Even Constable Hargreaves, usually impatient with prolonged reflection, straightened in his chair. Miss Marple's fingers paused on her knitting, and she began to recount the smallest matters with deliberate care. "First, there was the missing glass," she said, holding up her hand to emphasize the point. "A glass, taken or misplaced, that appeared only after the unfortunate collapse. Curious, is it not, that such a trivial item should draw such attention?" She allowed a brief silence, letting the detail settle in the minds of those present. Murmurs were restrained, for each person felt the weight of her gaze. Then there were the footprints, muddy and leading from the side door. She continued, her voice measured. They were discovered in the early hours, before the discovery of Mr. Denholm himself, who might have come and gone unnoticed, who might have approached him quietly, and why. She paused again, glancing toward Elsie Turner, who sat pale and tense, yet unmoved by accusation. "Footprints tell a story," Miss Marple remarked gently, "but they require interpretation, and it is interpretation that separates observation from understanding." The vicar, wringing his hands, leaned slightly forward. "And a lantern?" he ventured. "You found out a place, Miss Marple. What does that signify? A lantern may be carried with care or discarded in haste," Miss Marple replied, her knitting needles glinting in the firelight. "It marks a presence in the night, someone moving with intent, perhaps to conceal or to recover. Observe the small gestures of movement, and you will see the intentions of the hand that wields them." She then produced the faded letter, setting it gently upon the table. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances as she described its contents. A debt, a promise broken, and the hint of a motive rooted in past grievances. The air grew heavier, the silence almost tangible, as if the room itself waited for the final connection. "And finally," she said, lowering her voice to a whisper that carried across the room, "the faint traces discovered, bitter almonds, the smell of something lethal, beneath the hedge and near the vicarage gate. These were not accidents, nor mere coincidences. They were marks, left by a hand both determined and careful." A soft murmur swept through the assembly. Each villager felt a shiver of recognition at the way the clues aligned, forming a lattice of undeniable consequence. Eyes darted nervously, hands fidgeted with gloves or handkerchiefs. The tension built, knotting itself quietly around the hearth and the firelight. Miss Marple's pale eyes met each in turn, never lingering too long on any one face, yet always registering the subtle twitch of a lip, the rapid intake of breath, the avoidance of eye contact. She allowed the anticipation to thicken until the room was taut, a suspended cord vibrating on the edge of revelation. Then, finally, she spoke the name, slow and deliberate. The person responsible for Mr. Denholm's death is Reginald Harris. A gasp escaped Mrs. Armitage's lips. Elsie blinked in shock. Even the vicar's face drained of color. Yet Miss Marple did not continue. The room hung suspended, each breath held as the villagers awaited the next words. The reason, the motive, the story behind the hand that had struck. She leaned back in her chair, needles poised lightly, and let the silence stretch, for she knew that in suspense, the mind often unravels the rest before it is spoken aloud. Miss Marple allowed the room to settle, the fire crackling softly as if lending her words their rhythm. She looked around at the anxious faces, calm yet intent, and began to untangle the web that had ensnared St. Mildred's. Reginald Harris, she said, her voice steady, was a man long wronged in his own estimation. Years ago, he trusted Edward Denholm with both friendship and money. A sum not inconsiderable, lent in confidence, was promised to be returned upon need, yet was never repaid. And in matters of the heart, he too was deceived. Edward, you see, once interfered in an affections arrangement, securing for himself a young lady that Reginald had admired quietly, yet ardently. The room was silent, each villager absorbing the weight of these long-forgotten slights. Mrs. Fenton's pale lips pressed into a thin line. Even Elsie, who had feared accusation, listened with wide eyes, the innocence of youth giving way to comprehension of human complexity. Such grievances, Miss Marple continued, do not always lead to action. Yet for some, the burden of resentment grows with time, twisting patience into calculation. Reginald returned to St. Mildred's not merely as a visitor, but as a man intent on correcting old wrongs in a manner he believed justifiable, though misguided. She recounted the details with gentle precision. The footprints by the side door, made in careful timing. The extinguished lantern at the vicarage gate, designed to conceal presence. The missing glass, removed in a moment of panic or precaution. And the faint scent of bitter almonds, cyanide spilled in haste yet not perfectly hidden. Each small oversight was a thread that led inexorably to the truth, unnoticed by all but the most observant. The act itself, she said, pausing for emphasis, was intended to appear accidental. A faint heart, a sudden collapse, anything less suspicious. And yet, she added softly, the smallest traces were left. Footprints, a misplaced object, the faint scent, details that speak volumes when one knows how to listen. Miss Marple's knitting lay untouched in her lap now, her hands folded as her gaze rested firmly on Reginald Harris. It is easy to mislead, to weave a story of accident. But in the calm reflection of careful observation, even the smallest inconsistencies betray the hand that moves in secrecy. Reginald, pale and still at first, sank slowly into his chair. His hands trembled as if the weight of years had finally pressed upon him, his carefully maintained composure eroded by the undeniable clarity Miss Marple had brought to light. Eyes downcast, his voice hoarse and brittle, he whispered, I never meant. It was supposed to look accidental. I didn't think anyone would see. The confession was not loud, nor accompanied by dramatic gestures. It was weary, resigned, the tone of a man who had carried the burden of both hatred and regret until the moment of inevitable exposure. The villagers, though shocked, were held back from outburst by the quiet authority in Miss Marple's words and the solemnity of his yielding. Miss Marple nodded gently, as if affirming a point of fact rather than triumphing over discovery. It is done, Reginald. The truth is now clear, and there is no further need for concealment. It is only by careful attention that such secrets are ever revealed. And in the hush that followed, with the fire crackling softly and the village holding its collective breath, the enormity of years-old betrayals, cunningly executed plans, and overlooked details became plain to all. Chapter 8. Snow over St. Mildred's. The first snow of the season had fallen gently over St. Mildred's, blanketing the village in soft white, muffling the usual clatter of carts and footsteps. Chimneys sent up thin spirals of smoke, and the scent of wood smoke and roasted chestnuts drifted lazily through the crisp air. It was a quiet, contemplative morning, as if the earth itself wished to pause and consider what had transpired. In the post office, conversation was subdued. Mrs. Armitage fussed over the parcel she was sending, though her usual sharp commentary was softened, her words measured. "Well," she murmured to the clerk, "one never imagines a gala could end so terribly." The clerk nodded, neatly folding letters, his mind clearly still on the recent revelation. The tea-room, once abuzz with speculation, hummed instead with quiet understanding. Villagers murmured about the oddities of human nature and the strange swiftness with which joy can turn to sorrow. Yet there was relief, too, for the innocent had been freed. Elsie Turner, once the target of suspicion, was greeted with gentle smiles and whispered apologies. Mrs. Fletcher offered her an extra slice of seed cake, and Miss Hawthorne, still composed, nodded in a small, approving gesture. Miss Marple, sitting near the fire, observed all with her familiar serenity. She noted the softened eyes, the cautious gestures, and the tentative attempts at goodwill. Human nature, she reflected, was as unpredictable as the weather. In one moment, it could misjudge and accuse. In the next, it could show kindness and contrition. The vicar walked past, pausing to touch the firelight and exchange a word of quiet thanks with the detective. "Your observations, precise as ever, Miss Marple," he said, voice low, tinged with relief. "We could not have restored peace without your insight." She allowed herself the smallest of smiles, the corners of her lips barely lifting. "Peace is always restored, Reverend. In time, even the sharpest frost thaws. People return to their routines, children play again in the snow, and the heart finds room to forgive, or at least to accept." Outside, the village square gleamed under the fresh snow. Footprints marked paths that would soon vanish beneath new flurries, just as the past misdeeds and suspicions would fade from memory. Still, Miss Marple knew that the impressions left behind, like shapes beneath snow, remained subtle but telling, shaping the contours of human relationships long after the storm had passed. She sipped her tea, the warmth seeping gently into her hands, and observed the villagers' interactions with a quiet satisfaction. Life would resume its ordinary pace. The bells would toll, the post would arrive, gossip would circulate, yet the delicate balance of kindness and caution would endure, subtly altered by recent events. Finally, as the snow drifted softly against the window panes, Miss Marple murmured, more to herself than anyone else, her voice calm but reflective, "Truth, like snow, covers all in time, but leaves shapes beneath." The evening had settled gently over St. Mildred's, wrapping the village in a serene quiet that only freshly fallen snow can bestow. From her sitting room, Miss Marple watched the flakes drift lazily past the window, each one unique, delicate, and transient. The world outside seemed hushed, as if the earth itself were holding its breath after the recent turbulence, allowing space for reflection, for small reconciliations, and for the ordinary rhythms of village life to return. She settled into her favorite armchair, the worn upholstery soft against her frame, and poured herself a cup of tea. The porcelain warmed her hands, and the steam rose in gentle curls, carrying with it the faint scent of bergamot. She sipped slowly, savoring the ritual and the calm that came with it, a stark contrast to the anxious days past. Her cottage was quiet, yet alive with the small comforts of home. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls lined with neatly stacked books, knitted blankets, and the carefully tended plants that thrived in her windowsills. Each sound, the soft pop of the logs, the whistle of the wind against the eaves, reminded her of the constant interplay between disturbance and calm, between human folly and the quiet order that eventually reasserts itself. Miss Marple reflected on the events that had unfolded, the gala that began in laughter, the sudden collapse, the threads of long-held grievances, and the meticulous unraveling of secrets. She thought of Reginald Harris, weary now in his confession, of Elsie Turner, restored to innocence, and of the many villagers whose judgments and kindnesses had danced in turn with the shifting tides of suspicion. Human nature, she mused, was a complex tapestry, sometimes beautiful, sometimes flawed, but always compelling in its patterns. The bells of St. Mildred's Church tolled softly, each note resonating through the snow-draped village. Their sound was steady and reassuring, a reminder that life's rhythms endured, carrying the lessons of the past into the present and beyond. Miss Marple listened, letting the music of the familiar chimes mingle with the soft whisper of the fire and the occasional sigh of the wind. She glanced around her cozy room, eyes resting on her knitting bag, the unfinished work paused mid-stitch. Even in quiet, she recognized that mysteries never truly vanish. They lie in wait, tucked into corners, hidden in the daily exchanges and the fleeting gestures of the villagers. Yet there was comfort in knowing that clarity could emerge, patience could prevail, and small acts of observation, combined with a touch of empathy, could illuminate what was once hidden. A smile, subtle and knowing, curved her lips as she leaned back, her gaze once more drawn to the window where the snow continued to fall, unhurried and pure. She felt a gentle satisfaction in the return of peace to her village, in the delicate balance restored between caution and trust, suspicion and forgiveness. And yet, as the fire crackled and the teacup warmed her hands, her mind wandered, as it always did, to the possibilities that the next season might bring. Quietly, thoughtfully, she murmured to herself, the words more a question than a prediction. What secrets lie waiting for the next season? Outside, the village lay calm beneath the snow, but within Miss Marple's mind, the threads of curiosity, wisdom, and quiet vigilance were already weaving the beginnings of another tale. And so, dear friends, the village of St. Mildred's returns to its gentle rhythm. The Christmas Gala, once a scene of quiet festivity, is now a memory tinged with both sorrow and revelation, a reminder that beneath the softest manners may lie motives sharp as a winter frost. Miss Marple shows us, once again, that human nature is endlessly intriguing, capable of generosity and warmth, yet equally prone to fear, envy, and deception. But with patience, observation, and a touch of quiet insight, the truth, like a snowdrop pushing through frozen ground, always finds a way to emerge. Thank you for accompanying me through the tale of old friends, new murder. I wonder, if you had been at the gala, what small detail might have caught your eye? Do share your thoughts. Until we meet again, may your tea be warm, your hearth bright, and your curiosity ever lively.